the penultimate day of 2025, and this is BWI Live, Tuesday, December 30th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. We typically come to you on Wednesdays with this edition of BWI Live, but with New Year's Eve on the horizon, we bump things up a day. So, T. Frank, welcome to the final show for you and I, at least as things stand at the moment, of 2025. It's been quite the ride.
Yeah, it has been. I always say, or at least I did for 5 years of doing the show, I want to have a new conversation about Penn State football. You know, James Franklin, the narratives, everything was like set in stone. People had made their opinions. I had always thought it was going to be that they would get over the hump just because of like the upward trajectory of the program during that time. I didn't think we'd be sitting here with Matt Campbell as the head coach, with a coaching search on for the defensive coordinator, for all this topsy-turviness in football. But here we are. You never know what the future holds, and we are now on the cusp of 2026 and truly like a new era in Penn State football where I was thinking about this today, there are no established norms anymore. There are certain things that we think can continue to be the same, but they don't have to be. And that's, a lot of stuff that I'm interested in today with, obviously, we've been talking about the defensive coordinator news. But yeah, it's wild how much things have changed from this time last year when Penn State was in a playoff run to now they're reloading with a new coach and heading into a portal season where they're going to be heavy buyers. Like, wouldn't have thought that at this time last year.
No, I think if there's anything that is most memorable about 2025, T. Frank, it's going to be the fact that, whatever you think might happen between January and August is certainly not guaranteed to be what happens on the field once the games actually start from from September through December, which leads us here to a conversation to kick things off about the Penn State coaching staff in 2026. So I would guess maybe 2 hours after you and Sean went off the air on yesterday's BWI Live, which of course you can find here on the BWI YouTube channel, the reports broke that D'Anton Lynn, the former Penn State defensive back, multiple-time All-Big Ten selection at Penn State, and also longtime football coach, both at the NFL and most recently at USC as a defensive coordinator, will be taking that job on Matt Campbell's first staff at Penn State. So as we talk at 10:05 a.m. Eastern Time on December 30th, Penn State has not announced that move yet, but T. Frank, all signs point to that getting done either today or tomorrow. USC is playing in the Alamo Bowl tonight at 9 o'clock against TCU. So will this get done today? Will it get done tomorrow? I'm not sure at this moment in time, but certainly I think there's every bit of a chance it gets done today. And if not, I think almost certainly tomorrow. It probably just depends on how some of the puzzle pieces work with him, finalizing the dotting of all I's and crossing of all T's and all that stuff between his agent and Penn State and the lawyers that are involved in all that. But a guy who's been linked to this Penn State defensive coordinator job for a couple of off seasons when James Franklin was here. Now it looks obviously around the doorstep of getting done, and him coming to Penn State, albeit to work for Matt Campbell, not James Franklin.
Yeah, and it's annoying those details that actually finalize a contract. Again, why we didn't go yesterday with breaking news that he was hired as the defense coordinator, because technically even now as we talk about it, that is not factually true. And annoyingly, we follow those guidelines of is it factually true? But like, as you pointed out, multiple reports from quality sources have said that this is going to happen. We can discuss some of those things internally over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. But one thing that I think we've talked about, and one thing that it was brought up in the reporting, which Nate Bauer had discussed earlier, was that the buyout for D'Anton Lynn was too high. And that was a sticking point for Penn State. And so apparently something changed to that effect. Although even in these reports, that was something that they said, the buyout is a hurdle. Like last weekend when this was going on, yesterday that was still mentioned as part of the reporting. So we're going to see how dotting of I's and crossing of T's, as you mentioned, that's going to be the stuff that they're working out now. It's interesting. Like I think there's a question whether he coaches tonight or not. We'll find out about that. But it's an interesting fit. D'Anton Lynn was not what I expected when I turned on the USC film.
And he is a guy who, of course, spent the last 2 seasons with the Trojans, got his first coordinator work at UCLA as a defensive coordinator back in 2023, before Lincoln Riley hired him away from the crosstown rival of the Trojans to work for him in Los Angeles. So this will be his 4th season as a defensive coordinator coming up. Prior to that stop at UCLA, all of his coaching experience was in the NFL, some of which was under Bill O'Brien in Houston, some of which was under his dad, D'Anton Lynn, out west. And so he has moved, he has upgraded the defenses that he has coached so far at the college level. Now, did they take some statistical steps back in 2025 compared to 24? Yes, USC did. Was some of that personnel based and maybe not so much coordinator based? Yeah, I think so. Does he deserve some of the blame for that? Of course, absolutely. So he's an interesting guy to break down to you, Frank. We're just going to continue on this line of thought for a little bit, folks, because obviously it's the most interesting news of the moment. We'll get into some roster retention stuff a little bit later in the show as well. But for the time being, Lynn is interesting to break down because the word polarizing, I don't think is fair to describe his coaching and his results so far and things like that. But it does seem like USC fans, from what I've been able to gather, and people who cover USC are quite okay with him leaving, which is usually not what you're looking for. And yet, I just wonder if their expectations were maybe a little bit too high. But Penn
they didn't
State
have
fans,
good players.
Yeah. Right.
They didn't have good players. I'm sorry. I think that they tried to lean into the strengths of the defense. And the strength of the defense, based on what they did last year, was the coverage unit. But the coverage unit, when you're playing aggressive man coverage, we've seen it. Like when even if you have great corners, Penn State had great corners under Tom Allen. And, stylistically, it was fine, what they were doing, but it is a boom or bust strategy if you play a lot of man coverage and you blitz and you throw a lot of bodies at the offensive line. And that was really what they did last year was, so to me, the biggest influence on D'Anton Lynn that I see on film, and this is something I'm going to go back to, everyone's saying, T. Frank, watch the UCLA film. I wanted to get through enough of understanding what he was doing at USC to have a basis to then compare and contrast. So yesterday I was really diving into that film, but there's a lot of Baltimore Ravens here. So I know he coached for his dad with the Chargers, but to me, the biggest influence here is that Baltimore Ravens multiplicity. This is a defense that, yes, it bases out of a 4-down front, but they very much want to be multiple up front. So they want to be, looking at the USC defense, they tried to solve their problems through numbers in the run game, and they tried to solve it through scheme in the run game. So they ran a ton of fronts. They ran even fronts. They ran under fronts. They ran over fronts, wide over, wide under, true odd. They had some bare front in there, meaning they literally did a little bit of everything. But when it comes down to it, if your gap responsibility from your linebackers isn't great and your defensive line are not actually big enough to hold up against double teams and to hold the point of attack and allow guys to flow, then you're going to give up yards. And that was a bit of the issue with them, diving into the USC game. Some of the schematic weaknesses when you have 5 defensive linemen, or you're trying to find that blend of, running odd fronts from even alignments, meaning you're trying to take a 4-down defensive line and make it work or look like an odd front, you're just committing a lot of bodies to the line of scrimmage. And when you do that, this is what happens. You have to be complicated up front or complicated in the secondary, because there are not enough bodies to do complicated things on both levels of the football unless you've got some truly hybrid players. And that was, to me, the biggest thing. Is they did not have enough hybrid players to do a lot of what they wanted to do, which left weaknesses in the coverage. It left weaknesses on the edges, in the flats especially. And it's a bit of a calculated choice by D'Anton Lynn of he's going to try and take away one thing, understanding that there are weaknesses elsewhere. And I also was watching it and was a little frustrated of obviously they're going to target their tight end in the flat, because that's their, Oregon's best player. And you have to accept some of this as the limitations and decisions based on those limitations from a defensive scheme. But he is willing to adapt from year to year, because they didn't do any of that in 2024 at USC. Much more traditional 4-2 defense.
Right, absolutely. And so I think the interesting thing about that is, I don't know where this keeps coming from. It drives me a little bit crazy, though. Martin O'Connor says, not final. I thought this was done yesterday. So
it's because, people have said it's done, But that's the thing, is that's again why we don't say it's done. When people use terms like that and they say it's official, it's not. There are steps that need to be taken, but the agreement in principle, or whatever you might say.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
sorry, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. It's on the doorstep of being done, obviously. But, we've seen time and time again across college football, maybe not recently, but sometimes these things get to the 11th hour or beyond and then change. And so, no, it's not done yet. Did he tell USC he was leaving, as the LA Times reported? I'm sure. Obviously, we've reported as well that this deal is all but done. But it's not been announced by either side yet. So that's where we're at this point as of 10:12 a.m. Eastern time. If anything changes over the course of the next 45 minutes, we will let you guys know first. But at this point, not officially done as it relates to the final crossing of the finish line. But yeah, I mean, I remember watching that USC defense at the Coliseum last year, and then obviously watched them again throughout the course of this season. And, I think that some of it was definitely, I'll be curious, I guess, to see what he does with the players he's going to have on the Penn State roster, because, when they went out and got Tamir Robinson from Penn State this spring, who, by the way, ended up playing almost not at all for USC this past season. But
I thought that
was as clear of a signal of desperation, I think, as you could possibly get. For our linebacker situation is a big problem. We have to do something to try and fix it. Now, that something did not work as it relates to Robinson, but that also signals, I think, that what I was talking about earlier, the fact that, some of the roster that he either inherited or brought with him to USC over the 2 years he was there, obviously really only one of which as a recruiter as it relates to adding guys to the roster, wasn't up to par with what he either wanted or needed. And again, some of that's on him, some of that's on the players. But just curious to see what he does with these Penn State guys, assuming most of them stick around. He's losing a lot to the NFL and the portal already, but they can keep some of these guys, T. Frank. I think he's going to have a nice basis of players to work with that maybe he hasn't had in the past.
Yeah, but I think the Luke Wafel signing is both a signal and obviously not just a signal in recruiting, it's a signal for what do we need. They needed defensive linemen, and they did not have a stable of defensive linemen to do what they wanted to do. So they went out and overpaid, or paid. I'd say if Ohio State isn't willing to match the money, it's probably overpaying for a player, even if he's a guy that we all agree is an exceptional football player and worthy, one of the few people who might be worthy of that money up front as a true freshman. Even though that's total speculation. I understand there's the talent level and all those things, but if you're paying the highest rate, you're not, it might be overpaying. So I don't know why I'm trying to qualify the hell out of that statement, because it is what it is. Yeah. It is. They needed pass rushers, they needed defensive linemen, and Wafel is a guy who has versatility. I think he is a defensive end, but he's big and strong enough that if he's 265, 270, he can play head up on the tackle and outside. He's got that versatility, which speaks to maybe some of the things that he would want to do in this defense. And yes, I think with Penn State and their talent, there are more players who can do diverse things on the roster. Penn State's defensive end room in particular has a bunch of hybrid defensive ends. They have smaller, more athletic defensive ends. Yvonne Kamaju is kind of the outlier of the group compared to what they have been normally getting. Dennis Sutton, those are some of the outliers compared to the athletic speed guys that go to the NFL and play as, pure pass rushers off the edge. The thing that I find interesting is that D'Anton Lynn, former corner, his defense is really focused on the fronts. They play pretty traditional 4-2-5 defense from a coverage perspective, where their nickel corner is a nickel. They'll play three linebackers. That's what they did last year. They play three linebackers when they needed to, but really they play a nickel in the flat. They don't do a lot of three safety stuff. I would not characterize this as a three safety defense. This is a 4-2-5, and I think maybe even if they would, last year they used Gentry, 18. He's a 6'6", 225-pound linebacker. Yeah. Try to make sense of that. Try to make sense of a 6'6" linebacker. Right. It was very interesting. They used him in coverage. They used him almost the way that Penn State used Zakee Wheatley as a middle safety. He was an apex linebacker. He lined up behind the other linebackers at times so he could run right to left. They tried sometimes to use him walked up in the underfront where he would be the Sam linebacker on the edge. And I don't know that he was the guy that make any of that work. You might have a better opportunity with Penn State's roster and some of the guys who have the athletic versatility to do some of those things, which we can get to here in a second. I just want to go through some of my notes here because I wrote a bunch of stuff down that I thought was interesting. The biggest thing, though, Greg, that I think Penn State fans are going to be excited about is it the return of the big defensive tackle. D'Anton Lynn, and if you're going to be versatile up front and you're going to run some of these odd looks where you have a true nose tackle lined up over the center, and you're going to actually run those things not just as a starting location at the snap, but also then they play that way, you need a bigger guy. And I can see them going and getting true one-technique defensive tackles or nose tackles, whatever you want to call it, in the transfer portal or in recruiting. You cannot have an army of small defensive tackles and have those guys play these fronts. If you go and you look at the Baltimore Ravens specifically, what they did, and I don't think this is what Penn State will do, but just give you some of the blueprint of where this came from, they have two massive tackles in the middle. And essentially those players handle run fits and run support in the middle. And then you've got an army of versatility at linebacker and at edge defender. So those guys can blend in and out of the second level in run defense and in pass rush so that you don't know where the fits are coming from and you don't know where the alignments are going to end up. So getting at least one of those guys on the roster and consistently getting some of those bigger, more physical defensive tackles, I think that makes a lot of sense for this particular defense. And we've seen Matt Campbell. So as much as we talked about Penn State's going to run a 4-down front, I think even with all the things I'm talking about, I'm focusing on like the smaller cases of what they would do with their defensive line. This was a 4-down front. This is a 4-down defensive line. But I think this shows Matt Campbell, through his time at Iowa State, isn't married to just a 4-down front, like just 4 defensive linemen lined up in traditional overs and unders and attacking the offense that way. They're willing to do different things to create a different setup for the defense. And Greg, I actually made a handy chart to describe D'Anton Lynn because I've thrown a lot of words out there, but it might be helpful. Can I put this up here?
Sure. Okay, buddy.
So I call this the Pry-Diaz Index of defensive coordinators. This is the scale, and at 1 to 5, the numbers truly mean nothing. But on the left side, you have Brent Pry, traditional conservative 4-down defensive coach. He's going to go 4-3 with nickel at times, but wants to be like very conservative and traditional. And then on the other side, you have Manny Diaz, who's innovative, aggressive, and yes, it's a 4-2-5, but there's some wacky stuff that he does. And so on that spectrum, where do you find the current defensive coordinator for Penn State? And I think D'Anton Lynn checks in on the Manny Diaz side, although initially watching his defenses, they're very traditional from the coverage perspective, which made me like put him closer to 0. But the more I watch these fronts and the more I understand what he wants to do up front with pass rushers, hybrid players, it is more on that side, maybe even a tick farther than the Jim Knowles defense we saw last year. So that's what you're getting here in D'Anton Lynn. I think you're getting some more, all the concepts, all the execution is traditional, but using so many different fronts, if that is truly what they do at Penn State, is going to be more on that side of the innovative approach to Penn State style defense than it is, hey, we're going to spot drop and we're going to play quarters and we're going to play cover 6 and we're going to make sure that our fundamentals are great so that you can play fast, but we're going to do everything on a very base level. There's a little bit of that from what I've seen in this defense, but there's enough that I think pushes it more towards Manny Diaz. The problem is I keep changing my mind depending on the game I watch.
Yeah, and that's completely understandable because, again, I think Lynn, especially when injuries came into play at times for this USC defense, really had to adapt week in and week out. They weren't changing the whole plan, obviously. But certainly, again, I talked about it a few minutes ago, but they had issues at linebacker. And when you have an issue in the middle of your defense, Penn State fans, you know this well, it can be exposed pretty quickly. And it can make even your strengths look like weaknesses based on the fact that you don't have the best control of the middle of the field in your front seven as you possibly can. So, that's why, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, or maybe we'll talk about it now. You're going to tell me here in a sec. But, when you talk about who Penn State needs to keep moving forward, there's a reason that the guys like Tony Rojas and Amari Campbell are key keeps for this Penn State team if they can get them to agree to not end up going into the portal and decide to stay at Penn State. Now, I struggle a little bit with Rojas. I do, because I know how good of a player he can be. He's also now a guy coming off of first a shoulder injury from 2 years ago, and now a different issue this year. So, there's an obvious question to be asked there about how much do you want to commit to a guy with an injury history. But it feels to me like just watching how those two guys interacted, does it feel the same way to you that you're either going to have, in all likelihood, probably Campbell and Rojas on your roster next year, or you're not going to have either one of them?
I think that's how Tony sees it. And I'm going purely off of social media vibes, which everybody else is as well, right? Like, truthfully, that's the blessing and the curse of Tony Rojas being very active on social media is you have the perception of what the situation is, but we don't necessarily have the reality. But we do know that Tony Rojas is a critical reason as to why Amari Campbell's on the roster, because he kind of stumped for him to be the transfer portal target over Vabu Tore's brother, Muhammad Tore, right? Muhammad Tore, who went to Miami. Yep. So yeah, I would say yes, but also I'm open to the world where not everybody is doing what Tony says, if that makes sense. And again, I'm just it's too speculative. And I guess on a podcast it's fine. I wouldn't write that, but we could talk about it. I think that there's some reality there in between the margins. But I agree. When you're talking about the defense, if you want to do these complicated things and you want to have kind of the swirling chaos of a defense creating problems for an offense, one of the best ways to execute that properly is to have the middle of the defense secured so that you can not worry about gaps and fits and things like that up front. And the best way to do that is to have strong defensive tackles and have good linebackers. And, I would agree that even in this situation where we're talking about hey, what's the best way to allocate your resources? Should it be DNs and corners or whatever? Having good linebackers does give you that stability to be more creative elsewhere. And linebacker is really hard. That's the other thing is in modern football, no position is attacked more than the linebacker because of RPOs and because of run fits and things like that. So I think on the college level, there is an added value to having really good linebackers. And you see, again, if we use the Baltimore Ravens as a template, they went out and got Roquan Smith for their defense, and things changed dramatically. They were able to find that guy to be a good athlete in the middle to cover and to stop the run.
All right. Well, we're going to get a little bit more into some of the guys Penn State should and should not keep heading into the 2026 portal season, which, of course, officially starts January 2nd when the portal opens for a 15-day single window ahead of the 2026 season. But, of course, as you learned yesterday, and as we will probably learn later today, some guys are going in ahead of time. But first, let's talk a moment about Game Time, gametime.co. The best ticket marketplace for me, and I'm sure for many of you as well who have been listening to the show. Whether you want to get tickets to the World Cup, whether you want to get tickets to Penn State basketball or Penn State hockey or even Penn State football next year, whatever it might be, the Game Time app is a lifesaver because it gives the advantage back to fans with tickets to all the matchups you care about. You can track price drops in real time, get alerts when seats open up, and grab tickets the moment they hit the app, and it's all backed by the Game Time guarantee. So, T. Frank, I was looking at tickets recently for some football games later this year, and also just kind of curious what the college football playoff ticket prices were compared to what I was looking at when Penn State was playing in that last year, so you can look up those as well. Really anything, concert shows, movies, well, I guess not movies, but concert shows, obviously games, you can find it all at gametime.co, where you can take the guesswork out of buying college football or whatever it might be, tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code ON3 for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code ON3 on3 for $20 off your first purchase. Check them out, gametime.co. We appreciate them being a sponsor of the show. T. Frank, when it comes to D'Anton Lynn and this defense moving forward and who Penn State might want or need to keep to have the best opportunity for him to put a high-level roster out on the field, I mean, there's
Yeah.
nowhere else to start but with Darius Dixon, right? I mean, that is the
Yep.
we already talked about the linebackers, obviously, but Dixon, and I would even throw Jameer Joseph in that conversation as well. I think those two guys are keys for Penn State. In the secondary in 2026, obviously it looks like, or you're losing AJ Harrison at Washington at the very least. And so you need some bodies back.
Yeah.
And those two are pretty key along with Aldavian Collins.
Yeah, so it's funny. When we get into these situations and we talk about like who's important to retain, the problem is like the answer is everybody, right? You want to retain as many players as possible. And then so my brain edits down to, okay, let's play a game. And who are you can get 6. You can't get any more. You're not allowed to say, what about Alex Tash and Tony Rojas and Amari Campbell? Yeah, obviously LeVar Arrington, throw them all in there. What are the guys that are pivotal, the anchors of what the defense would be next year? So to me, Darius Dixon, I think the number one corner mentality he has, I think he will fit into whatever scheme you want to play him in. I don't know that you would want to play him in a lot of aggressive press man coverage and put him to the field so he's covering the fastest player on the field. But I do think outside of that, he can do anything you want him to do. And with the pressure package up front, that's a very good thing for him. He also was taking over A.J. Harris's role of playing the nickel or the dime on third down in the bowl game. So he's got the versatility to play inside too. I'm not saying you're taking your best corner and making him the nickel, but I think if you, let's say they get some Iowa State transfers and, some of those guys are pure outside guys, you could move Darius Dixon around. That flexibility and the talent, to me, that's why he's the guy that you want to play. And Jameer Joseph, by the way, had some of that as well, where he was playing the nickel this year in that Jim Knowles style defense. The other guy I think is D'Anton Lynn. If we want to talk about,
can I interrupt you, T. Frank?
Sure,
I interrupt you?
for it.
We got some breaking news to discuss.
Well, that's worth interrupting for. What's going on?
All right. Posting to Instagram. He will be back at Penn State in 2026. The third offensive lineman now to say he is coming back to the Nittany Lions. Anthony Donko will be back at Penn State in 26. He started guard this year, tackle this year. T. Frank, what is your initial reaction to this? Not, I guess, overly it's not shocking to me, I don't think, but also Penn State and Matt Campbell got to be breathing a sigh of relief that he didn't follow Phil Troutwine to Florida or otherwise decide to leave this program.
I think it's the biggest addition. It's the biggest retention that you can have for the Penn State roster. And I've talked about this multiple times on the show. The offensive line is going to be very hard to pull players from Iowa State. We talked about this with some of the offensive players that are in the transfer portal already. There aren't a lot of offensive linemen that you would feel comfortable with as far as production and proven talent, like Big Ten level talent. Anthony Donko is, in my opinion, at the best of his abilities, he's a future first-round draft pick on the offensive line. So not only from that perspective, but the consistency and the ability to keep guys in-house so that you're not changing out pieces and not going into the portal and having to overspend on offensive linemen, it's absolutely critical. And his position versatility means that if you get a bunch of tackles to stay, you can still play him at guard. If you get him to play tackle, then you can fill in with some guards. That ability to play 4 positions along the offensive line is absolutely a bonus, and he's the most talented player that they could retain. Retaining the O-line is absolutely essential for Penn State, and they're doing a very good job of that so far in this pre-transfer portal run-up.
Yes, they absolutely are. So at this point, Cooper Cousin has said he will be back. Owen Alicini has said he will be back. And so we'll see who else comes out and makes these declarations. If anyone does, I'm very curious to see how this all plays out, T. Frank. We've never dealt with this before. We've all dealt with portal season. We've all dealt with recruiting, commitments, decommitments, so on and so forth. We have never dealt with guys just deciding to announce they're coming back, even though, what else would they do, right? If they're not leaving, they are coming back. So I'm interested
and it's
to
also
see how many more of these guys do that. Right.
With Penn State before, they had a PR campaign of there would be an official tweet, there would be a graphic, there would be all of this stuff that the official accounts would all produce. You remember, like last year when Dennis Sutton came back and Drew Aller and Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, like there was a professional rollout, and now guys are just like, hey, I'm back. It's been spontaneous, and it's funny, like before this broke, I was trying really hard to scour the internet to make sure I didn't miss anything, and of course, when you're not looking, all this stuff happens. I want to go back to another person that you mentioned there. The retention on the offensive line has been exceptional. I know Cooper Cousins is going to get people very excited. Owen Alasini, to me, is the biggest win here outside of Anthony Donko because he's a left tackle. He's 6'8". He's unbelievably athletic, and we got to see him early in the year before they wanted to preserve his red shirt. The guy looked good. He could have played this year if they had needed him, if in a pinch down the road. Would he have been a freshman and made freshman mistakes? Yes, but physically he filled out to a point in his freshman year at 6'8" that he's a guy that you felt comfortable playing. Now, he went down to the third tackle once Egan Boyer came back and Drew Shelton was fully integrated back, all that stuff that happened in the spring and then in the summer. So we got to see a good bit of him in the offseason. I'm highly encouraged. Ryan Snyder on our recruiting show has been very high on Owen Alasini for a long time, and he's right. So they are, I think, killing it in terms of making sure they're getting essential pieces to build a competitive offensive line for 2026. Donko being the most important, but Cooper Cousins, Owen Alasini, if you were building your lineup for next year and going like, okay, what's the priority list? You've hit the top three, in my opinion.
Yeah, so far so good for Penn State. I see some people asking about other guys in the chat, and we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, I think that obviously some guys are going to at least explore their options before putting something out there like Anthony Donko just did. Other guys are not going to put out elaborate statements. Anthony Donko saying in part that he thanks James Franklin, Phil Troutwine, the entire coaching staff, wishes them all continued success. He says he has full confidence in Matt Campbell, Ryan Clanton, the offensive line coach under Campbell now, and the rest of the staff, and says, I believe they will help restore Penn State's tradition of excellence while continuing to support my growth to be the best man that God has called me to be. So he will be back at Penn State in 2026. There's a statement. If you're watching on YouTube, you can read it there. Obviously, we'll have this up over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com shortly if it's not already there. But a big get for Penn State, a big win.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I guess my final thought on this, T. Frank, is we'll see where Ryan Clanton wants to use him, guard or tackle. I'm going to assume tackle, but time will tell.
Right.
And also, when you look at the rest of the possible guys who could make announcements like this, I'll just be curious to see how many actually do, or how many of them just return and don't ever say anything. Because, again, there's a part of it that says, why would you have to say anything? Like, if you're going into the portal, yes. And if not, then you have eligibility left and you're coming back, right? So in theory, you don't have to say anything. So it'll be interesting to see how many more guys go this route. So far, we've just seen 3 offensive linemen do it. And I know there's a lot of names Penn State fans want to see make those announcements. But just keep in mind, obviously, at some point, the portal opens and closes. But not seeing an announcement like this from a guy does not guarantee he's leaving, I guess, is what my final word of caution would be.
Yeah, it depends on the guy's personality, right? Like, some of these offensive linemen probably don't like social media. They don't like the attention. And I'm not saying, like, it's a bad thing, right? So there is a certain amount of, like, this is how it goes in college football now, and some people are just going to adhere to the norms. And then other guys are going to be saying, like, you don't need to know my business, and they're going to be more, introverted, I guess is the psychological word to say. TJ Shanahan was really good, says Matthew John. The interesting thing is he said, and Phil Troutwine said, that TJ Shanahan specifically came to Penn State to be coached by Phil Troutwine. That was the reason he chose this place. So I think of the group, with that understanding, I would say that would be it's closer to 50-50, than some of these other situations. It would be a good get. I think TJ Shanahan's a good football player. Another year in the Penn State strength and conditioning program would be a benefit for him, whatever that looks like now, honestly. Like, we have to learn more about that. But that's just some of the context of what TJ Shanahan might be weighing as far as his 1 year in Happy Valley. The other thing I want to say, Greg, is that I think from a coaching perspective, having watched the Iowa State offensive line, I feel like they're coached well. And Ryan Clanton I have a positive opinion of him based on some of the things I've seen from his offensive linemen, especially guys at Iowa State. And again, no disrespect, that don't have as much talent as the guys here in Happy Valley. Their communication, their execution, all these things, the clarity with which the offense played, I think those are all things that are going to benefit these offensive linemen. And I can see why they'd be convinced to stay in this environment, because I feel like there are certain similarities and there's certain advantages to playing for Ryan Clanton. So I have a very strong opinion of Clanton so far based on my film analysis of the performance of his line, and I think he can do some good things with these players. So, I have a positive outlook now that some of the big pieces are falling into place. 3 does not make a full offensive line. You're going to need a lot more than that. They're going to need, you'd like to have a 2 deep, right, Greg? Like we've seen, they need to have a lot of players to get through a full season. So the work isn't done just yet.
No, not even close to done. And, I think there's a point here. Guys maybe making it public to try and help recruit players. This is from Jim in the chat. Like Cooper Cousins had already done in the past. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think
it's a good thought.
It's not an unfair thought. I just think it's more about the collective and Penn State wanting everyone to know to leave our guys alone, and that's just it. Like once you get a guy done, put it out there so they can leave guys alone, and that be that. But we'll see. There's a lot of different reasons guys put things out there without question, and it's been a busy few days at the Lash Building for that very reason. I was struck standing in the Bowsy Yankee Stadium talking to some guys, Quentin Martin being one of them, and obviously Ethan Grunkemeyer too. That's not true in the chat about Chuck Losey staying. He is not staying. He's been gone to Virginia Tech with James Franklin. So let's just clear that up quick. But a lot of these guys had conversations with Matt Campbell and his staff, but they were also trying to stay out of the way of the team's bowl prep and Terry Smith's leadership of the team prior to them taking over. So it was definitely a weird time. Ethan Grunkemeyer said, I thought was very candid about that it was just, it's hard. I mean, especially if you're him. You undoubtedly want to play your very best in this bowl game because at least in part, it's part of your film that's going to decide where you're at in 26. You're seeing on social media that Rocco Beck's going into the transfer portal. And you undoubtedly want to ask Matt Campbell and Taylor Mauser and Jake Waters, the head coach, offensive coordinator, and quarterbacks coach, respectfully, what that means. But you also don't want to get too far into the weeds and distract from your game planning. So I can only imagine what that last month has been like for Penn State coaches, Penn State players, and the new group that's come over from Iowa State. But certainly a lot for everyone to figure out over the 48 hours now since the bowl game. And obviously plenty more in the time between now and the portal opening on Friday. Yeah.
And there's going to be some surprises along the way as well, which is why you should subscribe here to the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. And, of course, you should subscribe to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. You can like this video. That always helps in the short term. I know that I'm in the similar situation of, like, I don't think to like videos at times, and if you want to support the channel, it's super easy. The number one thing is watch the stuff we do, listen to the stuff we do if you're listening to this on the podcast version, and be sure to subscribe, give 5-star reviews whenever you get the chance. But if you want more information, you want to go deeper, subscribe right now for that 50% off deal over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com.
Definitely check that out. There's a lot of talk over there about the defensive coordinator position. Obviously, there's more work to be done. Even with Lynn just about on board, you have to still find a defensive line coach, and how will they handle that? You have to still find a running backs coach, and how will Penn State handle that? You assume Terry Smith just slides back to his previous role before being the interim head coach, but is that going to be the case? We'll have to wait and see. And then that off-field staff part is a key component, probably an underrated component, probably from at least my perspective, I'll probably talk about it too much that maybe it's worth, but like these guys that Matt Campbell is evaluating in those off-field roles, some of them are going to follow James Franklin and or their coordinator elsewhere, but there's a lot of guys to hire, T. Frank, like guys and girls, I should say. I mean, it's a lot of people to hire because when you look at Matt Campbell's staff at Iowa State, between the recruiting department and the analyst, it was obviously nowhere close to what Penn State had under James Franklin. And if you're Matt Campbell, I can't fathom you wouldn't want to take advantage of those positions, but you also have to find people to fill them, right? And so I think that will be an interesting dynamic to keep in mind here as well. Obviously, with analysts being able to do on-field coaching stuff, it's unlike ever before in terms of the guys the people you can get to fill some of these roles. So just very curious to see how that all plays out. Very curious to see where some of these guys end up. As we talk at 10:40 on December 30th, Anthony Poindexter has not declared where he'll be in 26.
Yeah.
Marcus Hagans has not. Both are not expected back. Hagans already left. Talk about that a little bit more in a second. But Andy Kotelnicki has yet to find a spot. Just fascinated to see what he does. Like, is maybe a Kansas reunion in the cards? Is a place like Georgia Tech or UNC interested in him as an offensive coordinator, or even perhaps Clemson, who just fired its offensive coordinator on Monday night? So
that would be interesting.
Yeah.
It would be a fit, honestly. It would be a fit for Dabo Swinney is in what he likes to do. But having two former Penn State coordinators running the Clemson offense and defense, I don't know what that means, but it would be a funny thing.
I don't either, but it would be humorous, yeah. So I'm actually sort of rooting for that at this point, but we'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, you have all that movement to figure out. Deion Barnes and Stan Drayton are obviously already at South Carolina. Anyway, point being, between the transfer portal and staff changes, there's no better time to take advantage of our 50% off deal at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, so check that out today. The ultimate bundle between On3 and its national team, Rivals and its national team, and of course our Penn State team at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, let's move on now to a look at PSU in the transfer portal and roster retention. It's a good segue from our ad to this. So if you missed it yesterday, Anthony Ivy, longtime Penn State receiver, linebacker Keon Wiley, who I think is finishing his third or fourth season at Penn State. I think it was his fourth. Both electing to go into the transfer portal when it opens on January 2. No great surprise there, I don't think, for you or for me. I think it was more surprising we didn't have those stories ready to roll because honestly, both were, I think, obvious candidates to move on. Guys that have been here for a number of seasons and have yet to crack the depth chart in any meaningful way. I really thought Wiley, despite having some injury issues in the past, would find a bigger role for himself this year, T. Frank, and it just never happened.
Yeah, and part of it is the versatility. Ironically, I think that he would be a guy that D'Anton Lynn could use in a number of ways. Former high school defensive end who's very strong. You know, Dan Connor and a bunch of people this summer talking about like the strongest, most athletic guys in the room. One of the first guys to come up is Keon Wiley. But the problem is he didn't necessarily have the instincts, I think, to play linebacker, especially in coverage. And that's really hard. If you're not going to be the Mike linebacker and you're not going to have... Even the Mike linebacker has to have a very detailed understanding of zones, right? So you can't really hide a lot of guys in coverage, especially if that's not their strong suit. Because you talk about Kobe King being 250 pounds, but they found a way to use him. They found a way to make him a problem in coverage. Keon Wiley, to me, that was the thing from when I saw him play that was where the kind of the warts were that kept him off the field, especially at will, which is what the natural position would be for him, is to have that blitzing versatility, that athleticism, the ability to fit in some runs and to attack. And what they used him at the end of the season is that's how they used him. When he bumped over and played the will again after Tash got injured and they played him in the bowl game, he run blitzed a lot. They used him in a similar way to Dom DeLuca when they wanted to pull him out of some situations where it might be tricky for him. And so it was just the fit, the athleticism, the talent, but really he had kind of a hybrid skill set of being better as a pass rusher, being better going forward than as a guy who's 230 pounds, and you would love to have that coverage versatility where he can run in any direction, and it just never really developed.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, somewhat maybe similar to Tavia Robinson, just a guy who thought he is going to be able to go into the portal and find himself a better situation elsewhere. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Robinson, at least in terms of the amount of playing time he earned this year, did not find a better situation at USC. That is not a guarantee, of course, that he would have played more at Penn State this year. But yeah, interesting offseason ahead for D'Anton Lynn once that gets done as the defensive coordinator at Penn State, and also for Dan Connor, assuming he keeps Dan Connor as the linebackers coach, which, like, again, to go back to this whole conversation in the chat and also over on the Lions Den message board about why we are saying this the way we are saying it, it's because Penn State has not announced it yet, and I realize that all indications are that it was done, but guess what? At this time last week, when you guys were on the air, if I'm not mistaken, T. Frank, the indication was that Deion Barnes would be at Penn State in 2026. And by 6 o'clock Tuesday night, that was no longer the case. So that's why it's wait until the ink is dry kind of a game. And for Penn State, it looks like this will be dry and, at some point today or tomorrow. And it looks like Dan Connor will be back as well, but time will tell. So either way, go ahead.
I was going to say, this was, to my understanding, this was also what was taking some time to make all of those things finalized, is to have the defensive coordinator in place and allow him to have his input into the roles and situations and kind of some of those details. And so the agreement in place, agreement with understanding, is different than a signed agreement with all the specifics laid out. So, this is, I think, now that we almost have the D'Anton Lynn piece, the defensive coordinator piece in position, this should all fall together pretty quickly. And then, of course, they're going to need to find a D-line coach. There's some conversation about who that might be. But, yeah, to your point about Deion Barnes, had D'Anton Lynn signed with the program 2 weeks ago, maybe all of these things would have gone differently. I don't know. But that is something to think about in terms of, again, why we do things the way we do, talking about them the way we do, of not saying something's done when it's not technically done, and there's wiggle room.
Right. So time will tell on all that, but certainly it would make sense to have certainly would make sense for Dan Connor to stay at Penn State, for Lynn to want to keep him at Penn State.
Right.
And for Barnes, obviously you feel like it was best for him to go coach somewhere besides Penn State, which, again, there were some really good players developed under Deion Barnes, but there was also times when that overall group, and certainly this year, maybe didn't produce the results expected of it, and that's not all on him. It's not all on Torrance Brown and Greg Gattuso, two guys who were helping him for the analyst role. But certainly, we'll see if Penn State can find someone that both has recruiting chops, which we know Deion Barnes has, and also developing chops, which we know Deion Barnes did in some cases and not maybe so much in others. So, I think when you're talking about these announcements of guys coming back, T. Frank, you're hoping some of those, if you're a Penn State fan, you're hoping some of those come from the defensive line here before long. But almost similar to the running back room, like I don't know how you could make that announcement unless you just don't really want to go anywhere and you could care less who you play for. I don't know how you can make that announcement without knowing who your future position coach is.
Yeah, and it's going to not be, I don't want to say it's not going to be the same, but I think there's going to be a shakeup in the specifics of the defensive line room, where you're going to have two guys that have, and this was, I think, should be good for Penn State, where somebody who's an expert with defensive tackles will come in and run that particular unit, and then a guy, that has more experience with edge players can come in and run that unit. Because I think if you look at it, Deion Barnes and his work with Abdul Carter and with Chop Robinson, and there was clearly, as a former defensive end, Deion knew how to talk to those guys, and he knew how to relate the information. I watched him work with ends and young linemen at camps, and his ability to translate the information and to relay it and adjust players' performance as they're going through drills is really impressive. That is from the pass rushing perspective. As a guy who was a defensive end, I do think it's fair to say, the scheme this past year put the defensive tackles at a disadvantage, and they did not overcome it. Their skill set did not mesh exactly with what was being asked of them. And then it took a long time for the coaching to kind of adapt the players to the situation and find a common ground. And so you can put part of the blame on Deion Barnes, but I also think that is a situation with Jim Knowles asking defensive tackles to do something that they're not really set up to do. And so, I don't think you'll see that going forward with this particular defensive coordinator, pending his signing of the documents.
Yes. So one thing interesting that you just brought up that I thought is worth pointing out is that USC did have two defensive line coaches, and so not every school does that, and I guess in some respects, in the world of analysts being able to coach, you might have that even if you don't have it on paper that way, if that makes sense to anyone. You might have guys who are specifically working with one position or another, but under Lynn, I'm sorry, I was just checking something else, T. Frank, we'll talk about it off the air, but we don't got to rush off of here. But I guess is the simplest way to put it. But anyway.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so when you look at how Penn State might structure things under Matt Campbell on defense, I am curious to see if he pushes for someone specific for that defensive tackle role, and then someone specific for the defensive end role. And to me, it would make all the sense in the world to do that. I think that obviously, if you have the right bodies, the right people to do that, it makes sense to do it because you get specialized, focused, development and coaching. For each specific role along the defensive line. So curious to see how it works out, but considering what we know about the USC staff setup, I think it might be likely that happens. But then again, like Lynn, I think it's important to reiterate because I might have talked about it earlier, but I think it was right around the time the Donko stuff happened. But UCLA and USC didn't really hire any of his own staff. Most of those guys were either there when he got there or were hired without really any connection to him. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved with the process, of course, but that's another factor of all this as well.
It's not like he's got a whole group of people he's been bringing with him throughout his career. Yeah.
Yeah, like, do you remember Jim Knowles brought two analysts with him to Penn State. When Tom Allen was here, he brought people with him, his son being one of them, who then left for Clemson. Manny Diaz took some guys with him to Duke from the Penn State staff that he had wanted or either just became close with at Penn State. So, like, usually that's how this works. I'm not really sure. I was looking at the USC staff directory, T. Frank, and without having my notes in front of me, I can't say this 100% certain, but I really don't think I found any like direct connection. Like, okay, Lynn played with this guy, so that's why he hired him, or he coached with this guy, so that's why he hired him. Like, there's
Rob Ryan,
not a ton of connections.
Is Rob Ryan's the linebackers coach, right?
He has some kind of a role there, yes.
He has some kind of role. He was there in Baltimore with Lynn as an assistant coach with the Ravens. So that was the one guy I was thinking of, but with Dan Connor here, I don't know that would make a ton of sense unless Ryan was an assistant, like an analyst instead of a full-fledged position coach.
I don't know anything about Rob Ryan. Just seems like it would be a strange part of his life to be giving up palm trees for State College when
I don't think there's a fit there. I do not think there's a fit there whatsoever.
No. But you never know. We'll have to wait and see. This BWI Live, that's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. It is December 30th, the penultimate the penultimate day of 2025, and the final BWI Live of 2025, barring, I guess, something crazy happening that requires us to jump on here tomorrow. So, a fascinating year that it's been, and all eyes are now on 2026. It's interesting, T. Frank, because the 2025, I remember when the 2024 season ended, and I don't want to say it was hard to turn the page, but there was so much time I thought necessary for the fan base, for us, and for obviously the program to digest everything that happened during that season and how it ended. And then this year, it seemed like no one could move on from the Pinstripe Bowl fast enough. And it's just all about staff creation and all about portal building. And I get it. It's what matters, roster retention. People keep asking me over and over again, we're not done yet. I was just, thank you guys and gals for all listening to us. But no, we're not done quite yet. That was just
I got more takes. I got more thoughts.
A way of rolling us forward. But, a lot of people keep asking T. Frank, what do you think of Matt Campbell? And I said, I'll let you know at the end of January. Until they build out this roster, I think you can have all the opinions of the world of what he and the staff he has brought with him have done at Iowa State. But if they can't build a roster through the portal and retention of guys currently on the roster that is quality enough to compete for the things that Penn State and its fans believe they should be competing for, then you're going to be forced to have a different take for the offseason until you see it all in action in the fall.
Yeah, I guess the things that I've heard from him that he has said and then the actions they've taken so far, I think he's smart. I think he reads the room really well. His intention to keep his offensive staff intact, which is where his specialties are and what he understands, and his vision, I think, is more focused on the offense. And I think that's going to be refreshing for Penn State fans. I hope, I genuinely hope that they'll have interesting offense and that they'll have more clarity and execution on the offensive side of the ball, because that's what makes football fun. I know everyone says defense wins championships, but offense wins eyeballs. And I enjoy a good offensive performance. And I think, some of the things we talked about of kind of the things playing out the way I kind of read the room of the offensive line, trying to retain the talented young players on this roster. And then the looming specter of some of the offensive skill players coming over from Iowa State, along with the coaching staff, that makes a lot of sense. And then defensively, to bring in a guy like D'Anton Lynn, who I think has an NFL view of defense while still having traditional sort of concepts and a way of approaching things, it all makes sense. On the defensive side, trying to retain all of the lettermen he could, from Deion Barnes, which didn't work out, to Dan Connor, which reportedly is, we assume is going to work out, and of course with Terry Smith. So making sure you are keeping the ties tethered to the program where you need them, but making the changes where necessary. It all is making a lot of sense, and then it becomes when the rubber meets the road of like, how good are these coaches at getting the best out of these players? Because we have seen, I think it's fair to say, some middling results from talented players, and we've seen some issues and genuinely development in areas, but not across the board. There have been, it's fair to criticize certain areas where they have not developed players on the roster to get the most out of them. You are expecting that from the Iowa State staff to get the most out of every single player. And if they've got talent, then it should all work out in the positive. One thing I did want to get to that we didn't get to earlier in the show. I got to find it here because Matthew says Gilliam is the only good defensive tackle Penn State has with Durant gone. I would say he's the only proven one. I think there's some talent there. I don't want to throw away some of those young guys that have talent that they've recruited that we just haven't seen yet. But I do think a portal infusion at defensive tackle, I think that's something that should happen this year. Going back to some of the things that Penn State wants in this defense, I would assume that big defensive tackle, it really is not on the roster right now. But Gilliam, players that you need to keep, Xavier Gilliam, absolutely up on that list with Darius Dixon that we talked about a little bit earlier. So I just want to run down the 6 guys from earlier that I think they need to keep. D'Anton Lynn, Darius Dixon, Xavier Gilliam, and Max Granville, and then Rojas and Campbell are the 6 that I think are the core you would want to build around for this next year specifically. I understand there's guys that are talented with long-term skills that you don't want to lose, but if I got to line up with 11, and I'm going to get 6 from this roster and then the rest from the portal, I would say those are the guys that you absolutely have to have. King Mac, I think, is also important, but I wanted to limit myself, and I don't want you to think he's a bad football player or anything, but those are the guys that I think proved something this past year. And then pass rushing help absolutely is a priority. Defensive line in general is something they're going to have to figure out because they're figuring out the offensive line. I don't know if there's anything coming over from Iowa State on the defensive line, and I don't know that you would want it to. So that's going to be, to me, the D-line is a big portal emphasis for this team this year.
Yes, I don't think you're wrong about that at all. I just think it's, unfortunately for Penn State and its fans, hard to find. And everybody wants it, right? So I just think that when you look at where Penn State might decide to go in this portal cycle of 2025, there's a lot of spots they need to fill, and they're mostly spots that Penn State is going to battle some very either rich, successful, or both schools for. And so that'll be the challenge that Matt Campbell and his staff with new GM Derek Hoodger and whatnot have to overcome and face, is finding a way to get guys either to stay at Penn State or come to Penn State at premium positions that require premium amounts of dollars to get deals done. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But I'm with you there 100%. We mentioned that they're working on roster retention right now. We'll see how many more of those announcements come, like the one that did today from Anthony Donko. And then, I guess let's just wrap up T. Frank talking receivers. So we saw Lyric Samuel and Kobe Howard put some social media posts out on Monday thanking Marcus Hagans and sharing their disappointment that he wasn't going to be with Penn State in 2026. Little surprised. The guy is a tremendous person and connector with young people and people of all ages. So, for them to have the strong feelings they had about him, I completely understand. I was just a little surprised. It almost seemed like they were surprised that he wasn't coming back, which seemed pretty clear once Matt Campbell hired his own receivers coach.
Couple of freshmen as well, right? So guys that are still, I think, in that phase of their career. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that room plays out, because I think there's a certain portion of the fan base that's like, well, all these players need to go. They need a hard reset on the room. And I think there is, from a starting perspective, I think they should want to retain some of these players. Kobe Howard would be the top guy here, and the fact that he's putting out practice highlights. We see Aaron Enterline and some of those other people putting out practice highlights. So, is he actively looking for a different situation? Has he been convinced to stay? What's this? Having Kobe Howard on offense, I think, would be a valuable thing next year if they could make that happen.
Yes, it would. Speaking of valuable things, let's wrap up with best bets, the final one of 2025 from BetMGM.
Yeah.
All right, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code ON3, that's ON3, and you will get up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code ON3. Deposit at least $10 and place your first wager on any game, and you will receive up to $1,500 in bonus bets if your bet loses. Just make sure you use bonus code ON3 when you sign up. Make this college football season one for the history books and make it legendary. BetMGM. Pleased to be partnering with them all season long for this best bet segment. T. Frank, we have a lot of football left to be played, not as much as we once did. Obviously, bowl season and the college football playoff are winding to a close. I am going to start my best bets with a game today. So there's 3 games today: Coastal Carolina and Louisiana Tech, Tennessee and Illinois, and USC at TCU, or USC and TCU. TCU catching 5.5 points tonight in that game with a total of 56.5. I am going to take TCU to cover the 5.5 against USC. Obviously, that will require Penn State fans to maybe get some consternation about watching Lynn's defense at USC one final time, and we'll see how that all shakes out regardless. But I'm going to take TCU. They jumped off the page, before I even did any research for this segment, and obviously, opt-outs are just the way of life in the bowl game postseason world, but I'm going to roll with them. TCU plus 5.5 tonight, 9 o'clock on ESPN. Let's move into the college football playoff realm then. Tomorrow we have Ohio State taking on Miami in a college football playoff quarterfinal at the Cotton Bowl. Total for that game is 40.5 points, and Ohio State is minus 9.5. 40.5 is really low for a college football playoff total, in my opinion. But I don't think it's the wrong side to be on. So I'm going to take that under 40.5 in this Ohio State Miami game. I think that I think we'll see better offense out of Miami than we did in the opener when they beat Texas A&M.
Ohio State's pace of play is a big thing here, though, because
correct.
they play good defense and they like to control the football. So that number makes sense to me, too. I agree with you there.
It just feels to me like a 20-10 and Ohio State wins, something along those lines, 21-10. Even 21-13 would get us under 40.5. So I'm going to take the under in that game. And then moving on to Thursday's college football playoff games. Good schedule. Oregon's laying 2.5 against Texas Tech. Alabama is getting 7 against Indiana, and Ole Miss is getting 6.5 against Georgia. Give me the 7 points with Alabama, T. Frank. I'm not sure they win against Indiana, but I do like them to cover. I think this is a field goal game. So if you want to give me 7 or 4 more than a field goal, I will take them. All
right. Yeah, and that Indiana team, it's interesting. They kind of feel like Penn State at times where they're going to, no matter who the team is, they're going to play close, and they could win or lose any of these games, but they've won them all this year. Obviously, with the exception of some of the teams they absolutely curb stomped. But, the good teams they played this year, it was all tight games, and they came down and played really well in those games and won them. So I think you're in a close game. I think you're on to something there.
All right. Well, that's best bets from BetMGM. Check out our little outro here. We'll be right back.
See BetMGM.com for terms. 21 plus only. U.S. promotional offers not available in New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona, 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, and 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer now for new customers only. Subject to eligibility requirements. Rewards are not withdrawable bonus bets that expire in 7 days. In partnership with Kansas Crossings Casino and Hotel.
All right. Just want to wrap up by saying thank you all so much for listening to us throughout this 2025 Penn State football season. It was not the year that you or we expected to be following and talking about on December 30th. I don't know what odds BetMGM could have or would have given me on the final BWI Live of 2025 being about somebody else being the head coach besides James Franklin at Penn State, but I think they would have been pretty significant, T. Frank. And yet here we are. He's now at Virginia Tech. Matt Campbell is at Penn State and continues to build out his staff and get ready for the portal. So a lot more to talk about in 2026 without question.
Absolutely, and we're going to start it all off. By the way, I apologize. My terrible discipline today because I've been just refreshing social media trying to see if there's any other breaking news as we're getting out of here on the show. But that's why we're going to have our transfer portal show on Friday, where we're going to do Fitz and I are going to go live. We're going to talk about stuff. We're going to discuss some of these things we've talked about here, like the team building aspect of 2026, and try to kick it off the right way with as much intel, information, and perspective about the roster that Matt Campbell and his staff are building. So join us. And again, it's a special show. We're not on Wednesday or Thursday. If there's breaking news that we need to get to, big name players going into the portal, we'll handle that in the interim. Of course, commits and anything else like that. But Friday, 10 a.m., we're talking about the portal. We're talking about Penn State football. So join us again.
All right. I will look forward to watching that special show. Maybe I'll just jump on and join you guys. You never know. But for Thomas Frank Carr, for the rest of our BWI Live team, Sean Fitz, Nate Bauer, Ryan Snyder, I'm Greg Pickle, signing off for probably the final time in 2025 on this edition of BWI Live. We'll catch you Friday. The transfer portal opens then, but more news is coming, folks. You know it. I know it from a staff perspective, from a roster retention, inspection, and from a going into the portal perspective. So join us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Take advantage of that 50% off. Don't forget to like and subscribe the video and the BWI YouTube channel and your favorite podcast feeds. We'll talk to you in 2026, if not before. Have a good one, everyone.